Hi, this is Dan Macon with the University of California Cooperative Extension. I'm a livestock and natural resources advisor in Placer, Nevada, Sutter, and Yuba counties, and I'm producing this series of presentations and videos as part of my virtual grazing school. Today we're going to talk about the principles of managed grazing. So if we think about managed grazing, really it takes a shift in our thinking about what we do as ranchers. And really, ranchers are grass farmers who use livestock to harvest the crop that we grow. Our basic equation is to take soil and hopefully apply some water through precipitation or irrigation. Combine that with sunlight and carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to grow grass. So basically, we're capitalizing on photosynthesis, and we use livestock like sheep or goats or cattle to harvest the crop that we grow. The place to start then is really to think about how grass grows. And if we think about this first phase of our S-shaped curve of productivity in terms of forage, we've got phase one, where we have very few leaves. This might be just after germination or after we've grazed, but we have fewer leaves to capture sunlight. At this point, because we're not converting that sunlight energy into growth, we have slower recovery. We'll also likely have fewer and less vigorous roots as we're drawing energy from the roots to support leaf growth. In the case of germination, we may be drawing energy from that seed to support growth until those leaves can capture enough solar energy. This forage is highly nutritious, but there's just not enough to it. There's not enough there. And really, this reminds me of that old beer commercial that forage tastes great, but it's less filling. Highly nutritious, but not enough of it to meet our animals' demands. We might think of early germination on our annual rangelands as being this phase one growth, but we can also think about it as immediately following a graze period, a significant graze period, where we've removed the leaf area and those plants are having to draw on energy reserves from their root system to start to regrow. We can look at phase two then as that point where we've got lots of leaves to capture sunlight. We're really optimizing our solar panels on that plant. Depending on the time of year, we'll have rapid recovery, and we'll talk about how this changes during the course of the year. But we have a happy and vigorous root system. As we're capturing energy with the leaves, we're also rebuilding the roots beneath the soil surface. It's highly nutritious, and there's plenty of it. And at this point, we're kind of like kids in a candy store. There's everything we could possibly want. This is what phase two looks like on our annual rangeland. We've got lots of leaf area, highly palatable, highly nutritious forage in great quantity. Ultimately, we get to this third phase of plant growth or forage growth. And at this third phase, the plant is too big to capture enough energy during the day to replace the energy it loses at night. Some of those higher leaves may shade the middle or lower leaves, and we'll start to see those leaves die out. We will see lignification, which is the process by which the plant holds up that seed head as it's entering a reproductive phase. It's flowering and then producing seeds. And at that point, we'll have plenty of leaf material, but it's of low nutritional quality, and it may not be all that palatable either. Animals may not like to graze it because it doesn't taste good. And you may have heard this saying that we're belly deep in grass and starving to death. But we might have old rank grass that's in great quantity, but has very low nutritional quality or palatability, and so the animals don't do well on it. On our annual rangelands, we go through a phase, obviously, every summer where we get the golden hills of California, where most of the forage is dead. But we can also get to phase three on our irrigated pastures as well, as they go into seed production and reproduction. So if we think about maximizing photosynthesis, in phase one, we really don't have enough leaf surface to meet the energy needs of the plant. At phase 2, these forage plants are ideal solar collectors. They're maximizing photosynthesis. And at phase 3, lignification and shading can lower the nutrition and palatability of our forage. So what growth phase is most desirable from a livestock grazing perspective? We need to think about when plants will recover most rapidly after grazing, and we need to think about when the recovery rate is the slowest. So if you think about that rapid recovery, it's springtime. We go through the spring flush of growth. Temperatures are moderated. We've got plenty of sunlight. We've got soil temperatures that are optimal. And so those plants are really going to grow rapidly. We also go through a really slow growth phase, even on our annual rangeland in midwinter, when the soil temperatures and the air temperatures are lower, when the days are shorter, and we actually will go into a dormant period where the plants really aren't growing much at all. I think it's important at this point to talk a little bit about overgrazing. It's a term that many of us have heard and that we need to be aware of when we're talking about managed grazing. But my definition is that grazing a plant, and it's important to focus on that it happens a plant at a time before it has recovered from the previous grazing. So we can have plenty of standing forage in a pasture, but if a particularly palatable plant has been grazed before it's recovered from the previous grazing, that plant can be said to be overgrazed. Overgrazing then is really a function of time, not of animal numbers. So we can have lots of animals and not overgraze. We can have one animal that's in a pasture for too much time and have overgrazing. It can occur in two ways. One is that the animals stay too long and get a second bite of that plant before it's recovered from the first bite. So a plant is grazed, the leaf material is removed, and as it starts to regrow, again, perhaps drawing energy from its root reserves, a second bite can cause overgrazing. The other way that it can happen is that if we have too short a rest period for those plants to recover, the animals come back too soon. And as we talked previously, those recovery periods or rest periods can change depending on the season. So our first and I think most important grazing principle is to adjust our rest periods to match the growth rate of the plant. So here we might have a really long rest period on our annual rangeland in the late fall, early winter, where we've got to provide enough rest for those plants to grow. And then by the same token, we might have really rapid recovery rates in the springtime, where we can afford to do a shorter rest and still get those plants back into the top end of that phase 2 growth. So what about annual rangelands? Many of us here in California graze on annual rangelands during at least part of the year. And these rangelands will typically have two dormant periods where they're not growing much or where they're growing very slowly. Wintertime, we have cold, short days, as I mentioned, not enough sunlight hours. And so even if we have germination in the fall, we get to a point in the winter where it's just too cold and the days are too short for those grass plants to grow. On annual rangeland also, we'll reach maturity sometime in the late spring or early summer, at which point those plants aren't going to grow at all. They're actually dead. And so at that point, we have to wait for germination the following fall. Rest periods on some of these lands during slow growth may be as long as 120 to 150 days. But during the rapid growth phase, which typically lasts from 30 to 60 days in the springtime, we may be able to graze those landscapes every 21 to 25 days. Another important element on managing annual rangelands is to think about our residual forage or residual dry matter. This is the leftover material that we don't graze that provides soil protection and really an important microclimate for germination for next year's rangeland forage. The appropriate amount of residual dry matter depends on the slope at the site, other vegetation that might be present, what the climate's like, how much rainfall we can expect, and a variety of other factors. And I think it's also important to remember, and we'll talk about this in a later presentation, is that annual forage can be budgeted after it's finished growing. So when we get to late May or June and we know how much annual forage we've grown on our rangeland, we can think of that as a lower quality standing hay crop that then we can budget out through the rest of the grazing season. I want to turn now and talk a little bit about grazing behavior and animal impacts. And I think a little bit about the three main impacts that grazing animals can have on a plant or on a pasture. I think most of us think of this, animals with their heads down grazing. So grazing and consumption is one of the primary impacts that grazing animals have. But we'll also step on some of that forage, and we'll come back to why this is important as well. But trampling is one of those impacts that we can manage to our benefit for particular goals. And then lastly, after everything eats, it's going to do something else, right? And so animals will deposit manure and urine on the soil surface, which can create some opportunities to transfer nutrients over the landscape. But if you've ever looked at a pasture and how animals graze around manure pats or around spots where they've urinated, this creates what's called a zone of repugnance as well. And so as more manure deposition happens, more and more of that pasture is not going to be grazed because the animals won't graze right up around that manure. All of this is important because we're trying to maintain forage intake. Increased consumption of forage means increased weight gain if we're finishing animals. Increased consumption of high quality forage can also do things like increase conception rates or help animals put on bone and fat and muscle. Voluntary forage intake is controlled by three factors: the grazing time, the biting rate, and the bite size. Maximum intake occurs when the pasture is between 6 and 15 inches of height. Now, those of you that have goats or that run on brush pastures with cows or sheep will know that looks a little bit different with browse as opposed to grazing forage. But there is a maximum intake in terms of the amount of leaf material available for browsing animals as well. Forage consumption will decline as more plants are impacted by trampling and manure deposition or urine deposition. And so what we find is that if we have very short graze periods, we can actually maintain a higher level of forage consumption than if we have longer graze periods. And so our second grazing principle is to use the shortest graze period possible while maintaining adequate rest. So we don't want to lose sight of the first grazing principle to adjust our rest periods, but then we want to use the shortest graze period that we can to increase forage consumption. We should also think a little bit about uniformity of consumption. If you've been around grazing livestock, you'll probably recognize the difference in these photos. But think about which scenario is more likely to result in uniform consumption of the forage plants in these pastures. And in this regard, stock density and herd size matter. So our uniformity of consumption increases with stock density. And really, I think of the sheep or the cows saying, if I don't graze this plant, my neighbor will get it because they're just right here next to me. And so I need to graze it or somebody else is going to get it. The uniformity of our other animal impacts, like trampling and manure deposition, increases with herd size. And we can optimize these impacts if we've got the largest herd size possible. So one of our grazing principles is to use the highest stock density we can. And we can think about this in terms of the animals per acre. In both of these pastures, we're harvesting 100 stock days worth of feed. So we've got one animal who can graze there for 100 days, would eat the same amount theoretically as 100 animals for one day. We measure density in the number of animals per acre. And so if we think about this, what are the two ways that we can increase stock density? Obviously, we could add animals, and that would increase the density of animals within that pasture. But we can take that pasture and cut it into smaller subsets as well, which would increase our animal density. This is important when we start thinking about impacting the carbon cycle as well. And so we can graze that carbon that's standing out there. This is a yellow star thistle patch near Auburn in late June. And so we're trying to impact that carbon that's standing. But we can also impact it by trampling. And this is that same field in the wintertime when that star thistle is dead. And rather than try to graze it, at which point it would have virtually no nutritional value, we can try to trample it, which will allow the soil microbes to incorporate that organic matter into the top layer of the soil. And so to do this, we really want to think about using the largest herd size possible, consistent with sound animal husbandry practices. And again, this is not necessarily related to overgrazing. If you'll think back to our definition of overgrazing, it's not a function of animal numbers, but it's a function of time. The last point that we want to think about is stocking rate and carrying capacity. And if you've had Economics 101, you are familiar with that idea that we try to match demand and supply in a market, so we come to an equilibrium. And really, carrying capacity is the supply of forage that our pasture or rangeland systems can provide. We control the stocking rate, or the number of mouths and the type and size of the livestock, or the demand side of that equation in balancing stocking rate and carrying capacity. This is not necessarily an easy task on our annual rangelands. This is data from 1979 through 2002 from the Sierra Foothill Research and Extension Center in Browns Valley in Yuba County, fairly similar to where I am here in Auburn. And you'll note that thin green line is forage production on an annual basis, and it varies from just over 1,000 pounds per acre of forage in 1987-88 to almost 5,000 pounds of forage per acre in 1992 and 93. You'll also note that while there does seem to be some relationship to forage production and total precipitation, that timing is really important in terms of our precipitation as well. So if rain comes at exactly the right time, we get more forage growth. It's interesting to note that in the wettest years, we didn't necessarily have our greatest forage production. But what about now? That ran us up through 2002, but let's maybe look at what's happened more recently here in Auburn and at the Sierra Foothill Rec. So most of you will remember, if you ranched in the 2011 to 2015 period, that we had lower than expected rainfall and we had lower than expected forage production. We had a maximum in that time frame of just over 3,000 pounds to the acre, and we were running significantly lower than our normal precipitation as well. We returned to more normal precip in 2015-2016 and actually set a record here in Auburn in 2016-17. And if you look at 2017-18, we actually set a record in terms of forage production at SF Rec with over 5,000 pounds to the acre. So with all of that variability and all of it depending on the timing and amount of precipitation, how do we adjust our stocking rate to deal with those changes in productivity? Now, in terms of seasonality, there are some other issues that we need to think about. This is a photograph of some rangelands that we graze west of Auburn in December. A fair bit of standing dead forage, but not much green showing underneath it. And so we need to think about what the carrying capacity of those rangelands would be under those conditions versus something like this. This is irrigated pasture near Auburn, photograph taken in May, and there's substantially more higher quality forage in that picture than there is in the picture from December. So our last grazing principle is really to think about adjusting our stocking rate to seasonal and annual changes in our carrying capacity. And there's several ways that we can go about doing this. So on a seasonal basis, one of the things we can do is match the reproductive cycle of our animals with the forage cycle on our rangelands or in our pastures. So a ewe that is nursing a lamb or a cow that's nursing a calf is going to need 1.5 to 2 times the amount of forage that a non-lactating female will need. And so if we match our reproductive cycle, match that birthing period with rapid growth in the forage, we can seasonally adjust our carrying capacity. We can also wean the offspring to adjust. If we ship them off the ranch at weaning, that means we've not only reduced the amount of forage that the cows or the ewes or the does need because they will quit lactating, but we've removed those extra mouths and reduced our seasonal demand. We can think about buying or not buying feeders or stockers, depending on what the season brings us in terms of forage production. And then if we have a year where we've got lots of extra forage, a particular time of year, say in the springtime, we can think about custom grazing for other producers. And you may be able to think of some other ways that you could seasonally adjust your stocking rate in your operation. Now, if we look at annual adjustments to stocking rates, again, we can buy or decide not to buy feeders or stockers, depending on when germination happens or if we've got a particularly good grass year. Again, we can custom graze for other producers in good years and decide not to do that in years that are less productive. We can also think about retaining or selling replacement females. You know, in a year that looks like it's going to be lower productivity, like this year perhaps, we can decide that we're going to keep fewer replacement ewe lambs or heifers. And then you may be able to think of some other things that you can do in your own operation to deal with those annual variations as well. So I want to end with some thoughts about changing management. So for many of us, these principles represent a pretty significant change from the way that we've managed our ranches. Many of us have always set stocked our ranches where we turn animals out in the fall, come get them in the spring. We try to stock those ranches conservatively and thinking about doing things like adjusting our stocking rate seasonally or allowing plants to rest so they can regrow represents a pretty big departure from business as usual. And I think one of the things for us to consider is that these changes in management will often result in at least a temporary decline in system performance as we figure this new system out. Ultimately, though, if we stick with these changes, we'll take performance to a new level. And I think that's the important piece of these transitions, that you have to give yourself time to learn the system and the livestock and the pastures time to adjust, but then we'll achieve greater productivity as we go forward. Some of the barriers to change, at least in our own operation, have certainly been availability of capital. If we're thinking that we need to add more fences and more water points and more infrastructure to accommodate these grazing principles, and we don't have the money to do it, that can be a barrier to making these changes. Inertia is certainly an issue. Probably all of us have heard somebody say at some point, well, we've always done it this way, and that can be a barrier to doing something differently. Labor availability for some of these types of management techniques may be a limiting factor, and the cost of labor can be a factor as well. The biology of the animals that we're dealing with can be a factor. You know, if we're deciding that one of the ways we want to be able to adjust stocking rate to look at our annual and seasonal carrying capacity changes is to change from a fall calving to a spring calving herd, that's something we can't just do overnight. And so that transition takes time. And because of that transition can also have some pretty significant cash flow impacts that we need to consider. Some of us are more averse to risk than others. There's always a risk to doing something different than your neighbors are doing. Some of us are more comfortable with risk than others are. And then finally, I think this idea of a life-work balance is important. I think all of us ranch because we love the work, but we also have other things in our lives that we love to do, and maintaining some balance in that regard is really important. There may be some other barriers to change that you've experienced in your own operation as well. So just to recap, I want to walk through the 5 grazing principles with you once more. First and foremost, we want to adjust the rest periods to match the growth rates of the plants. We want to rest those plants while they're regrowing so that we have a healthy plant to graze again. We want to use the shortest graze period possible while maintaining adequate rest for those plants. That will increase consumption of forage. We also want to use the highest stock density possible and the largest herd size possible, consistent with sound animal husbandry practices. This will increase the uniformity of consumption and also optimize those other animal impacts of trampling and manure and urine deposition. And then finally, we want to adjust our stocking rate to those seasonal and annual changes in carrying capacity. If you have questions, I will be posting additional videos in this series on our virtual grazing school. But you can email me at dmakin@ucanr.edu. You can also check my website. And we do have a Ranching in the Sierra Foothills YouTube channel where these will be posted. You can post questions in the comment section there.